The Western world, also known as the West and the Occident, is a term referring to different nations depending on the context. There are many accepted definitions about what all they have in common. The concept of the western part of the earth has its roots in Greco-Roman civilization in Europe, and the advent of Christianity. In the modern era, Western culture has been heavily influenced by the traditions of the Renaissance, Protestant Reformation, Age of Enlightenment Euro, and shaped by the expansive colonialism of the 15th–20th centuries. Before the Cold War era, the traditional Western viewpoint identified Western civilization with the Western Christian countries and culture. Its political usage was temporarily changed by the antagonism during the Cold War in the mid to late 20th century. The term originally had a literal geographic meaning. It contrasted Europe with the linked cultures and civilizations of the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia and remote Far East, which early modern Europeans saw as the East. Today, this has little geographic relevance, since the concept of the West expanded to include the former European colonies in the Americas, Russian Northern Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. In the contemporary cultural meaning, the phrase Western world includes Europe, as well as many countries of European colonial origin with substantial European ancestral populations in the Americas and Oceania. Introduction: Western culture originated in the Mediterranean basin and its vicinity. Greece and Rome are often cited as its originators. Over time, their associated empires grew first to the east and west to include the rest of Mediterranean and Black Sea coastal areas, conquering, absorbing, and being influenced by many older great civilizations of the ancient Near East. Later, they expanded to the north of the Mediterranean Sea to include Western, Central, and Southeastern Europe. Christianization of Bulgaria, Christianization of Kievan Rus, Christianization of Scandinavia and Christianization of Lithuania brought the rest of present-day European territory into Western civilization. Historians, such as Carol Quigley in The Evolution of Civilizations, contend that Western civilization was born around 500 AD, after the total collapse of the Western Roman Empire, leaving a vacuum for new ideas to flourish that were impossible in classical societies. In either view, between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Renaissance, the West experienced a period of first, considerable decline, and then readaptation, reorientation and considerable renewed material, technological and political development. This whole period of roughly a millennium is known as the Middle Ages, its early part forming the Dark Ages, designations that were created during the Renaissance and reflect the perspective on history, and the self-image, of the latter period. The knowledge of the ancient Western world was partly preserved during this period due to the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire and the institutions of the Catholic Church. It was also greatly expanded by the Arab importation of both the ancient Greco-Roman and new technology through the Arabs from India and China to Europe. Since the Renaissance, the West evolved beyond the influence of the ancient Greeks and Romans and the Islamic world due to the commercial, scientific, and industrial revolutions, and the expansion of the peoples of Western and Central European empires, and particularly the globe-spanning empires of the 18th and 19th centuries. Numerous times, this expansion was accompanied by Christian missionaries, who attempted to proselytize Christianity. Generally speaking, the current consensus would locate the West, at the very least, in the cultures and peoples of Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Latin America. There is debate among some as to whether Latin America is in a category of its own. Also, there is debate among some as to whether Central and Eastern Europe is in a category of its own. An argument supporting Central and Eastern Europe being a part of the West is that Central European, Southeastern European and Baltic countries such as Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania and Croatia are now part of the European Union and NATO, which mostly comprise Western countries. These countries were both heavily influenced by and influenced the Western world, and share sociological values and culture. The Russian culture is classified as a part of the Western culture. Russia is often not counted politically as a part of the Western world due to contemporary political isolationism of the country. Western culture. The term Western culture is used very broadly to refer to a heritage of social norms, ethical values, traditional customs, religious beliefs, political systems, and specific artifacts and technologies. Specifically, Western culture may imply a biblical Christian cultural influence in spiritual thinking, customs and either ethic or moral traditions, around the post-classical era and after. European cultural influences concerning artistic, musical, folkloric, ethic and oral traditions, whose themes have been further developed by Romanticism. A Greco-Roman classical and Renaissance cultural influence, concerning artistic, philosophic, literary, and legal themes and traditions, the cultural social effects of migration period and the heritages of Celtic, Germanic, Slavic and other ethnic groups, as well as a tradition of rationalism in various spheres of life, developed by Hellenistic philosophy, scholasticism, humanisms, the scientific revolution and Enlightenment. The concept of Western culture is generally linked to the classical definition of the Western world. In this definition, Western culture is the set of literary, scientific, political, artistic and philosophical principles that set it apart from other civilizations. Much of this set of traditions and knowledge is collected in the Western canon. The term has come to apply to countries whose history is strongly marked by European immigration or settlement, such as the Americas, and Oceania, and is not restricted to Europe. Some tendencies that define modern Western societies are the existence of political pluralism, lacism, generalization of middle class, prominent subcultures or countercultures, increasing cultural syncretism resulting from globalization and human migration. The modern shape of these societies is strongly based upon the Industrial Revolution and the society's associated social and environmental problems, such as class and pollution, as well as reactions to them, such as syndicalism and environmentalism. Historical divisions. The geopolitical divisions in Europe that created a concept of East and West originated in the Roman Empire. The Eastern Mediterranean was home to the highly urbanized cultures that had Greek as their common language, whereas the West was much more rural in its character and more readily adopted Latin as its common language. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western and Central Europe were substantially cut off from the East where Byzantine Greek culture and Eastern Christianity became founding influences in the Arab Muslim world and among the Eastern and Southern Slavic peoples. Roman Catholic Western and Central Europe, as such, maintained a distinct identity particularly as it began to redevelop during the Renaissance. Even following the Protestant Reformation, Protestant Europe continued to see itself as more tied to Roman Catholic Europe than other parts of the perceived civilized world. Use of the term West as a specific cultural and geopolitical term developed over the course of the Age of Exploration as Europe spread its culture to other parts of the world. In the past 2 centuries the term Western world has sometimes been used synonymously with Christian world because of the numerical dominance of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism compared to other Christian traditions, ancient Roman ideas, and heresies. As secularism rose in Europe and elsewhere during the 19th and 20th centuries, the term West came to take on less religious connotations and more political connotations, especially during the Cold War. Additionally, closer contacts between the West and Asia and other parts of the world in recent times have continued to cloud the use and meaning of the term. Hellenic. The Hellenic division between the barbarians and the Greeks contrasted in many societies the Greek-speaking culture of the Greek settlements around the Mediterranean to the surrounding non-Greek cultures. Herodotus considered the Persian Wars of the early 5th century BC a conflict of Europa versus Asia. The terms West and East were not used by any Greek author to describe the conflict. The anachronistic application of those terms to that division entails a stark logical contradiction, given that, when the term West appeared, it was used in opposition to the Greeks and Greek-speaking culture. Western society traces its cultural origins, at least partially, to Greek thought and Christian religion, thus following an evolution that began in ancient Greece and the Levant, continued through the Roman Empire, and spread throughout Europe. The inherently Greek classical ideas of history and art may, however, be considered almost inviolate in the West, as their original spread of influence survived the Hellenic period of Roman classical antiquity, the Dark Ages, its resurgence during the Western Renaissance, and has managed somehow to keep and exert its pervasive influence down into the present age, with every expectation of it continuing to dominate any secular Western cultural developments. However, the conquest of the western parts of the Roman Empire by Germanic peoples and the subsequent dominance by the Western Christian papacy, resulted in a rupture of the previously existing ties between the Latin West and Greek thought, including Christian Greek thought. The Great Schism in the Fourth Crusade confirmed this deviation. On the other hand, the modern West, emerging after the Renaissance as a new civilization, has been greatly influenced by Greek thought, which was preserved in the Roman Empire and the medieval Islamic world during the medieval West's Dark Ages and transmitted from there by emigration of Greek scholars, courtly marriages, and Latin translations. The Renaissance in the West emerged partly from currents within the Roman Empire. Roman Empire. Ancient Rome was a civilization that grew from a city-state founded on the Italian peninsula about the 9th century BC to a massive empire straddling the Mediterranean Sea. In its 12th century existence, Roman civilization shifted from a monarchy, to a republic, to an autocratic empire. It came to dominate Western, Central and Southeastern Europe and the entire area surrounding the Mediterranean Sea through conquest using the Roman legions and then through cultural assimilation by giving Roman privileges and eventually citizenship to the whole empire. Nonetheless, despite its great legacy, a number of factors led to the eventual decline of the Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire eventually broke into several kingdoms in the 5th century AD due to civil wars, corruption, and devastating Germanic invasions from such tribes as the Goths, the Franks and the Vandals. The Eastern Roman Empire, governed from Constantinople, is usually referred to as the Byzantine Empire after 476, the traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and for the subsequent onset of the early Middle Ages. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the fall of the West, and protected Roman legal and cultural traditions, combining them with Greek and Christian elements, for another 1,000 years. The Roman Empire succeeded the about 500-year-old Roman Republic, which had been weakened by the conflict between Gaius Marius and Sulla and the civil war of Julius Caesar against Pompey and Marcus Brutus. During these struggles hundreds of senators were killed, and the Roman Senate had been refilled with loyalists of the First Triumvirate and later those of the Second Triumvirate. Several dates are commonly proposed to mark the transition from republic to empire, including the date of Julius Caesar's appointment as perpetual Roman dictator, the victory of Caesar's heir Octavian at the Battle of Actium, and the Roman Senate's granting to Octavian the honorific Augustus. Octavian Augustus officially proclaimed that he had saved the Roman Republic and carefully disguised his power under republican forms. Consuls continued to be elected, tribunes of the plebeians continued to offer legislation, and senators still debated in the Roman Curia. However, it was Octavian who influenced everything and controlled the final decisions, and in final analysis, had the legions to back him up, if it became necessary. Roman expansion began long before the empire and reached its zenith under Emperor Trajan with the conquest of Dacia in AD 106. During this territorial peak, the Roman Empire controlled about 5,900 km² of land surface and had a population of 100 million. From the time of Caesar to the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome dominated Western Eurasia comprising the majority of its population, and trading with population living outside it through trade. Ancient Rome has contributed greatly to the development of law, war, art, literature, architecture, technology and language in the Western world, and its history continues to have a major influence on the world today. Latin has been the base from which Roman languages evolved and it has been the official language of the Catholic Church and all religious ceremonies all over Europe until 1967, as well as in all the official language of countries such as Poland. The Roman Empire is where the idea of the West began to emerge. Due to Rome's central location at the heart of the empire, West and East were terms used to denote provinces west and east of the capital itself. Therefore, Iberia, Gaul, Mediterranean coast of North Africa and Britannia were all part of the West, while Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt and Libya were part of the East. Italy itself was considered central, until the reforms of Diocletian, with the idea of formally dividing the empire into true two halves, Eastern and Western. In 395, the Roman Empire formally split into a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern one, each with their own emperors, capitals, and governments, although ostensibly they still belonged to one formal empire. The dissolution of the Western half left only the Eastern Roman Empire alive. For centuries, the East continued to call themselves Eastern Romans, while the West began to think in terms of Latins and Greeks. Christian schism. In the early 4th century, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great established the city of Constantinople as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire included lands east of the Adriatic Sea and bordering on the Eastern Mediterranean and parts of the Black Sea. This division into Eastern and Western Roman empires was reflected in the administration of the Christian Church, with Rome and Constantinople debating over whether either city was the capital of Christianity. As the Eastern and Western churches spread their influence, the line between Eastern and Western Christianity was moving. Its movement was affected by the influence of the Byzantine Empire and the fluctuating power and influence of the Church in Rome. Beginning in the Middle Ages, religious cultural hegemony slowly waned in Europe generally. This process may have prompted the geographic line of religious division to approximately follow a line of cultural divide. Huntington argued that this cultural division still existed during the Cold War as the approximate western boundary of those countries that were allied with the Soviet Union. Others have fiercely criticized these views, arguing they confuse the Eastern Roman Empire with Russia, especially considering the fact that the country that had the most historical roots in Byzantium, Greece, expelled communists and was allied with the West during the Cold War. Still, Russia accepted Eastern Christianity from the Byzantine Empire, linking Russia very close to the Eastern Roman Empire world. Later on, in 16th century Russia created its own religious center in Moscow. Religion survived in Russia besides severe persecution, carrying values alternative to the communist ideology. Under Charlemagne, the Franks established an empire that was recognized as the Holy Roman Empire by the Pope in Rome, offending the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. The crowning of the emperor by the Pope led to the assumption that the highest power was the papal hierarchy, establishing, until the Protestant Reformation, the civilization of West Christendom. The Latin Rite Christian Church of Western and Central Europe headed by the Pope split with the Eastern, Greek-speaking patriarchates during the Great Schism. Meanwhile, the extent of each expanded, as British Isles, Germanic peoples, Bohemia, Poland, Hungary, Scandinavia, Baltic peoples and the other non-Christian lands of the northwest were converted by the West Church, while Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, Belarus, Serbia, Caucasus and most of Ukraine were converted by the Eastern Church. In this context, the Protestant Reformation may be viewed as a schism within the Latin Church. Martin Luther, in the wake of precursors, broke with the Pope and with the Emperor, backed by many of the German princes. These changes were adopted by the Scandinavian kings. Later, the commoner Jean Calvin assumed the religio-political leadership in Geneva, a former ecclesiastical city whose prior ruler had been the bishop. The English king later improvised on the Lutheran model, but subsequently many Calvinist doctrines were adopted by popular dissenters, leading to the English Civil War. Both royalists and dissenters colonized North America, eventually resulting in an independent United States of America. Colonial West, the Reformation, and consequent dissolution of West Christendom as even a theoretical unitary political body, resulted in the 30 Years' War. The war ended in the Peace of Westphalia, which enshrined the concept of the nation-state and the principle of absolute national sovereignty in international law. These concepts of a world of nation-states, coupled with the ideologies of the Enlightenment, the coming of modernity, the scientific revolution, and the industrial revolution, produced powerful political and economic institutions that have come to influence most nations of the world today. Historians agree that the Industrial Revolution was one of the most important events in history. This process of influence began with the voyages of discovery, colonization, conquest, and exploitation of Portugal and Spain. It continued with the rise of the Dutch East India Company, and the creation and expansion of the British and French colonial empires. Due to the reach of these empires, Western institutions expanded throughout the world. Even after demands for self-determination from subject peoples within Western empires were met with decolonization, these institutions persisted. One specific example was the requirement that post-colonial societies were made to form nation-states, which often created arbitrary boundaries and borders that did not necessarily represent a whole nation, people, or culture, and are often the cause of international conflicts and friction even to this day. Though the overt colonial era has passed, Western nations, as comparatively rich, well-armed, and culturally powerful states, still wield a large degree of influence throughout the world. Although not part of Western colonization process proper, Western culture entered Japan primarily in the so-called Meiji period, though earlier contact with the Portuguese, the Spaniards and the Dutch were also present in the recognition of European nations as strategically important to the Japanese. The traditional Japanese society was virtually overturned into an industrial and militarist power like Western countries such as the United Kingdom. Cold War context. During the Cold War, a new definition emerged. Earth was divided into three worlds. The first world, analogous in this context to what was called the West, was composed of NATO members and other countries aligned with the United States. The second world was the Eastern Bloc in the Soviet sphere of influence, including the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, East Germany, Czechoslovakia. The third world consisted of countries, many of which were unaligned with either, and important members included India, Yugoslavia, Finland and Switzerland. Some include the People's Republic of China, though this is disputed, as the People's Republic of China is communist, had friendly relations at certain times with the Soviet bloc, and had a significant degree of importance in global geopolitics. Some Third World countries aligned themselves with either the US-led West or the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc. A number of countries did not fit comfortably into this neat definition of partition, including Switzerland, Sweden, Austria, and Ireland, which chose to be neutral. Finland was under the Soviet Union's military sphere of influence but remained neutral, was not communist, nor was it a member of the Warsaw Pact or Comecon but a member of the EFTA since 1986, and was west of the Iron Curtain. In 1955, when Austria again became a fully independent republic, it did so under the condition that it remain neutral, but as a country to the west of the Iron Curtain, it was in the United States sphere of influence. Spain did not join the NATO until 1982, towards the end of the Cold War and after the death of the authoritarian Franco. Modern definitions. The exact scope of the Western world is somewhat subjective in nature, depending on whether cultural, economic, spiritual or political criteria are employed. Many anthropologists, sociologists and historians oppose the West and the rest in a categorical manner. The same has been done by Malthusian demographers with a sharp distinction between European and non-European family systems. Among anthropologists, this includes Durkheim, Dumont and La Copyright by Strauss. As the term Western world does not have a strict international definition, governments do not use the term in legislation of international treaties and instead rely on other definitions. Cultural. From a cultural and sociological approach, the Western world is defined as including all cultures that are directly derived from and influenced by European cultures, that is Western Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe and Southern Europe, in the Americas, and Oceania. Together these countries constitute Western society. In the 20th century, Christianity declined in influence in many Western countries, mostly in the northern, central and eastern parts of Europe and elsewhere. Secularism increased. However, while church attendance is in decline, some Western countries believe that religion is important, and most Westerners nominally identify themselves as Christians and attend church on major occasions, such as Christmas and Easter. In the Americas, Christianity continues to play an important societal role, though in areas such as Canada, low level of religiosity is common as a result of experiencing processes of secularization similar to European ones. The official religions of the United Kingdom and some Nordic countries are forms of Christianity, even though the majority of European countries have no official religion. Despite this, Christianity, in its different forms, remains the largest faith in most Western countries. See ARDA Data Archives at http://www.theodicumregionsindex ASP, Modern Political. Countries of the Western world are generally considered to share certain fundamental political ideologies, including those of liberal democracy, the rule of law, human rights and gender equality. Normally, all of these principles are prerequisites for a state to become a full member of both the Council of Europe and the European Union and, therefore, from a modern political point of view, all European Union member states from Western, Central and Eastern Europe are considered part of the Western world. Economic. Though the Cold War has ended, and some members of the former Eastern Bloc make a general movement towards liberal democracy and other beliefs held in common by traditionally Western states, most of the former Soviet republics are not considered Western because of the small presence of social and political reform, as well as the significant cultural, economic and political differences to what is known today as described by the term the West: North America, Europe, Australia and New Zealand. The term Western world is often interchangeably used with the term First World, stressing the difference between First World and the Third World or developing countries. This usage occurs despite the fact that many countries that may be geographically or culturally Western are developing countries. In fact, most of the Americas are developing countries, which make up a significant percentage of the West. It is also used despite many developed countries not being Western. The existence of the North implies the existence of the South, and the socio-economic divide between North and South. The term the North has in some contexts replaced earlier usage of the term the West, particularly in the critical sense, as a more robust demarcation than the terms West and East. The North provides some absolute geographical indicators for the location of wealthy countries, most of which are physically situated in the Northern Hemisphere, although, as most countries are located in the Northern Hemisphere in general, some have considered this distinction equally unhelpful. The 34 high-income countries in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which include Australia, Canada, Chile, Iceland, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, Switzerland, the United States and the countries of the EU, are generally included in what used to be called Developed World, although the OECD includes countries, namely, Mexico and Turkey, that are not yet fully industrial countries, but newly industrialized countries. Although Andorra, Cyprus, Hong Kong, Malta, Liechtenstein, Monaco, San Marino, Singapore, Taiwan and Vatican City, are not members of the OECD, they might also be regarded as developed countries, because their high living standards, high per capita incomes, and their social, economic and political structure are quite similar to those of the high-income OECD countries. Other views. A series of scholars of civilization, including Arnold J. Toynbee, Alfred Kroeber and Carol Quigley, have identified and analyzed Western civilization as one of the civilizations that have historically existed and still exist today. Toynbee entered into quite an expansive mode, including as candidates those countries or cultures who became so heavily influenced by the West as to adopt these borrowings into their very self-identity. Carried to its limit, this would in practice include almost everyone within the West, in one way or another. In particular, Toynbee refers to the intelligentsia formed among the educated elite of countries impacted by the European expansion of centuries past. While often pointedly nationalist, these cultural and political leaders interacted within the West to such an extent as to change both themselves and the West. Yet more recently, Samuel P. Huntington has taken a far more controversial approach, forging a political science hypothesis he labeled the Clash of Civilizations, in a Foreign Affairs article and a book. According to Huntington's hypothesis, what he calls conflicts between civilizations will be the primary tensions of the 21st century world. In this hypothesis, the West is based on religion, as the countries of West and Central Europe were historically influenced by the two forms of Western Christianity, namely Protestantism and Catholicism. Also, some Anglophone countries share these traits, for example Bermuda, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Palau, Australia and New Zealand, as well as the more heterogeneous United States and Canada. The identification of Western civilization with the Western Christianity was not Huntington's original idea, it was rather the traditional Western viewpoint and subdivision before the Cold War era. Huntington's thesis, while influential, was by no means universally accepted. Its supporters say that it explains modern conflicts, such as those in the former Yugoslavia. The thesis's detractors fear that by equating values like democracy with the concept of Western civilization, it reinforces stereotypes that some perceive as being common within the West about non-traditionally Western societies that some may consider racist or xenophobic. Others believe that Huntington ignores the existence of non-Western democracies such as the East Asian and South Central Asian democracies. As such, these detractors believe that it will provoke and amplify conflict rather than illuminate a way to find an accommodating world order or, in particular cases, a commonly agreed solution. In Huntington's narrow thesis, the historically Eastern Orthodox nations of southeastern and Eastern Europe constitute a distinct Euro-Asiatic civilization. Although European and mainly Christian, these nations were not, in Huntington's view, shaped by the cultural influences of the Renaissance. The Renaissance did not affect Orthodox Eastern Europe due in part to the proximity of Ottoman domination, despite the decisive influence of Greek copyright migrant copyright scholars on the Renaissance. Other views might be made regarding Hungary and Russia. The theologian and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin conceived of the West as the set of civilizations descended from the Nile Valley civilization of Egypt. Palestinian-American literary critic Edward Said uses the term Occident in his discussion of Orientalism. According to his binary, the West, or Occident, created a romanticized vision of the East, or Orient to justify colonial and imperialist intentions. This Occident-Orient binary focuses on the Western vision of the East instead of any truths about the East. His theories are rooted in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. The Occident would not exist without the Orient and vice versa. Further, Western writers created this irrational, feminine, weak other to contrast with the rational, masculine, strong West because of a need to create a difference between the two that would justify imperialist ambitions, said influenced Indian-American theorist Homi K. Bhabha. The term the West may also be used pejoratively by certain tendencies and especially critical of the influence of the traditional West, due to the history of most of the members of the traditional West being previously involved, at one time or another, in outright imperialism and colonialism. Some of these critics also claim that the traditional West has continued to engage in what might be viewed as modern implementations of imperialism and colonialism, such as neoliberalism and globalization. Allegedly, definitions of the term Western world that some may consider ethnocentric others consider constructed around one or another Western culture. The British writer Rudyard Kipling wrote about this contrast, East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet, expressing his belief that somebody from the West can never understand the Asian cultures as the latter differ too much from the Western cultures. Some may view this alleged incompatibility as a precursor to Huntington's clash of civilizations theory. Paradoxically, today Asia and Africa to varying degrees may be considered quasi-Western. Many East Asians and South Asians and Africans and others associate or even identify with the cosmopolitan cultures and international societies referred to sometimes as Western. Likewise, many in the West identify with a transcultural humanity, a notion often found in visions of the sacred. From a very different perspective, it has also been argued that the idea of the West is, in part, a non-Western invention, deployed in the non-West to shape and define non-Western pathways through or against modernity. Views on Latin America, by Huntington. A controversial theory of Huntington is that he considered the possibility of Latin America being a separate civilization from the West, but also mused that it might become a third part of the West in the future. The term Latin America in itself is a French invention to denote American countries of Iberian heritage, to remember them in a way of their closer linguistic and cultural relatives in Europe, and an approach to diminish the growing influence of the Anglosphere countries in the region, and some countries, such as Portuguese-speaking, largely either itself identified or Lusophone-identified, historically largely Francophile Brazil, and Marxist-Leninist, historically largely Hispanophile Cuba, do not necessarily fit more to the group in relation to other Western nations in various factors. Therefore, many believe this view would be another event of U.S.-American generalizations and little knowledge on the region's cultures and people's realities and their individualities. Huntington did not present any evidence that Latin Americans see themselves as foreign in comparison to other Western cultures, or even a probably existing Western point of view of Latin Americans as foreigners in relation to Europeans and their direct descendants. With the Latin American racial whitening policies, reflecting a still living regional tendency to the preference of imitating or prizing not only North American and European appearance, but also fashion, cultural taste and items, political values and even lexicon or given names, it seems more ludicrous that the reality is most often quite the reverse, that is, that Latin Americans, especially those from Brazil and the Southern Cone, would be readily phobic about being authorized by Westerners and put in the same category as their often ridiculed or disparaged worker classes and rural people, or poorer neighboring and close cultural relative nations, and thus, as a consequence, also phobic to being seen as collectively very different, or as special in general. Views on Turkey. By Huntington. According to Huntington, Turkey, whose political leadership has systematically tried to westernize the country since the 1920s, is his chief example of a torn country that is attempting to join Western civilization. The country's elite started the westernization efforts, beginning with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who took power as first president of the modern Turkish nation-state in 1923, imposed Western institutions and dress, embraced the Latin alphabet, joined NATO, and are seeking to join the European Union. It should also be noted, however, that the integration of Turkey with the West can be traced back to the 18th century, during which the Ottoman Empire was actively engaged in westernization. By others, in a 2010 interview given to the Times newspaper of the United Kingdom, President Abdullah Gül Kurtulmuş of Turkey stated that his country is part of the West. In a more recent interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski by the English-language Turkish daily newspaper, Today Zaman, the former United States National Security Advisor also stated that Turkey is part of the West despite its religious diversity. See also, Americanization, Anglicization, Atlanticism, Eastern World, Europeanization, Francophony, Golden Billion, Hispanophone, Russification, Russophone, Western esotericism, Western philosophy, Westernization, Western culture, organizations, Council of Europe, European Economic Area, Group of Eight, representation in the UN, Eastern European Group, Western European and Others Group, maps. References. Further reading, Ankle, Guy. Coexisting Contemporary Civilizations are Arabo-Muslim, Bharati, Chinese, and West. INU Societal Research. Volume 1. Geneva, INU Press. ISBN A2-88155-004-5. Bavage, Ricardo, The West: A Conceptual Exploration, European History Online, Mainz, Institute of European History, 2011, retrieved, November 28, 2011. Dutchson, Ricardo, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, Studies in Critical Social Sciences, Volume 28, Leiden and Boston, Brill, ISBN 978-90-04-19248-5, J.F.C. Fuller. A Military History of the Western World. 3 volumes. New York, Da Capo Press, Incorporated, 1987 and 1988. V1. From the Earliest Times to the Battle of Lepanto. ISBN 0-306-80304-6. V2. From the Defeat of the Spanish Armada to the Battle of Waterloo. ISBN 0-306-80305-4. v3. From the American Civil War to the End of World War II. ISBN 0-306-80306-2.